Oh, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this morning. I see here many people, many members of our advisory committee at CEBRI. It's nice to start this week, this first week of the year, with a very interesting conversation. Since last Saturday morning, these have been very busy days for us, international analysts, and I would like to thank you, the speakers, for the promptness and willingness to accept the invitation to share your views with our CEBRI audience. So today we have here our special guests. First, Juan Gonzalez, Senior Director of the National Security Council for the Western Hemisphere of the United States during the Biden administration and Resident Fellow at Georgetown Americans Institute. We also have Christopher Garman, Managing Director for the Americas at Eurasia Group. We are expecting Hussein to join us in a short time. He is our International Advisory Board of CEBRI and former Special Secretary of Strategic Affairs of Brazil. And also for co-moderating this panel with me, our Deputy Director of the Geopolitics Program, Ariane Costa. Thank you very much. Before we start, I would like to make a brief disclaimer that throughout the week, we made several attempts to bring high-level speakers directly involved in the region, particularly from Venezuela and Colombia, and especially women authorities to make me company in this conversation. But unfortunately, we're not able to coordinate this agenda. So I'd like to acknowledge this absence and say that it leaves an important gap to our discussion. But we the urgency of the topic and also the need for a timely position and also risk analysis that we want to offer this morning. With that, I would like to begin with a checking question and a slightly different question from usual, because I would like to propose like a 1-minute response just to see how we arrive here today for this conversation. And I will start with Chris, then Juan and Hussein, if you can join us in time. And my checking question is, how surprised were you when you read the news last Saturday morning? And what are like immediate feelings? And why now? What do you think was the trigger for the US intervention at this precise moment? Not before, not later. This would be our checking question. So Chris, could you start? Thank you.
For sure. And first and foremost, thank you, CEBRI, Fernanda, Ariane, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be on the panel here with Juan and Hussein when he joins. I think it was a mixed bag of reactions, to be quite honest, Fernanda. I think on the one hand, we weren't surprised that there was going to be military action in Venezuela. We at Eurasia Group, had already been betting that we're going to have some kind of military action, beyond just the sea interdictions. We even, published and were communicating to our clients that we felt that, there was a higher than even odds of Maduro not surviving over the next 6 months. So that didn't come as a surprise, given the size of the military buildup, the deployment of the assets. It was too much resources to not do anything more meaningful. What surprised us was the efficacy of the military action to snatch and grab, the swiftness of it, the lack of resistance. Either this is probably a function of the military planning, maybe some cooptation within the regime. So that came as a surprise. We didn't have that as our base case, but there could have been ways that this would have been more drawn out. And then I would say from a timing point of view, this was, number one, there was a long period of intelligence gathering, preparation, that kind of led to a lead up. We were expecting something before Christmas, but I think the New York Times did a good reporting on this. This was probably driven by folks being out on break, and they were just waiting for the weather to break. So I think that from an operational point of view, that probably explains the timing of it.
Perfect. Hussein, welcome. We are waiting for you to join us. And we just started with a check-in question, very quick response, 1 minute, just to ask you, how surprised were you What did you feel when you read the news last Saturday morning? And why now? So I jump back to you, and then I go to Juan. Thank you. Your mic is.
Thank you, Fernanda. It's a great pleasure to join you and to join my friend Juan Gonzalez and Christopher Garman. Good to see you both. You look in a good. You both look in a great shape, by the way, right? Juan, you look even younger, my friend. Well, sorry about my delay. I was chasing internet, so I'm in vacation, but on a small island, and to find a very good connection is quite hectic. So now I got it. Well, there's a lot to say about it. Of course, it's highly surprising what has happened in Caracas and the military action that has been implemented by Trump administration. Why I'm saying that from the Brazilian perspective, and if we talk about the Brazilian foreign policy establishment and Brazilian national security establishment, they never ever imagined an action in such a way. And if you look for the official statements, they talking about kidnapping, right? So it's very important to look to that word, sequestro do presidente Maduro,
Okay.
right? So the wording is very, very important, and I have never ever seen a press release from the Brazilian Foreign Ministry stating in such strong word about an action, because of course you can make a condemnation, you can reject whatever, but the wording are really important. Trata-se de uma ação que ultrapassou os limites do inaceitável. Has surpassed the limits of the unacceptable.
So this was your reaction as well, like, because the question is your feelings, immediate feelings at this morning. Just this is our checking question.
Yeah.
Okay. I will pass over to Juan, and then we go back to start our presentations.
Yes.
Juan, what's your feeling?
Well, thank you for the invitation. It is for me a privilege to speak at CEBRI, a forum that has long really emphasized the importance of Brazilian leadership and the regional autonomy in shaping the future of South America. I also love to be sharing the panel with Hussein and Christopher, who I know well and have great respect for. Look, I don't know if I was surprised, because I felt like the next step in the escalation was missile attack on land, or just the destruction of Venezuela's air defenses as a way to try to destabilize the military. This was, from everything I know and from my experience on the National Security Council and all the intelligence that we review, I know very well the security environment around Caracas. And I concluded that it's just a very high denial environment, and that pulling off an operation of that type was going to be very risky. It was incredibly risky. And I think, I'll tell you as an aside, all the information the U.S. administration has leaked about this operation makes me very uncomfortable as a sophisticated consumer of intelligence, that highly sensitive intelligence programs are being disclosed by this administration, including the existence of a covert program. Makes me very uncomfortable. It is. I think it demonstrates the ability and the strength of the U.S. to do this sort of thing. But I also think it is, I think my main conclusion in this whole presentation is that, like, day one excitement risks being a mission accomplished moment for this administration, similar to what Bush did around Iraq. So I think right now we're seeing some short-term instability, and this could get really crazy. But I was confused and surprised and a little bit concerned about what comes next for Venezuela.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, I think after this checking, then we come to our presentation. Just like to inform that the idea is to keep our discussion up to 12:30 in Brazil, so 10:30 in US. I will have a first round, 10 minutes each, And the main question for our presentation is exactly this that Juan just brought, like what comes next? What can we expect for Venezuela and for the region as a whole after this operation? And Juan, for you, I think we are very curious to see, because how do you interpret the current US policy toward Venezuela within the broader hemispheric strategy? Is this a return to historical patterns of engagement or a new strategic approach? And of course, what are the key limits on Washington's ability to extend or repeat such actions in other countries across the region? So my plan is to start with you, and then we go to Chris and Hussein, who is from our board advisory here. CEBRI concludes these presentations. Okay, great. I might need to go, and then Ariane can keep the moderation with me. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Okay, well, that is the key question on everybody's mind. I'll speak from my experience. As you mentioned, I served on the National Security Council a total of 7 years between the Obama and Biden administrations. I had hair when I started, just to give you a sense of how stressful it could be. But I also worked at the State Department. And I was involved in the negotiations, sanctions design, and coordination with partners in the region and beyond. And that experience really shapes how I view this moment. So as I said, the removal of Maduro has created the appearance of resolution. And I think from a policy perspective, it marks something else entirely. I think it marks the beginning of a much more complex and frankly dangerous phase for Venezuela, for the region, and for the U.S. So briefly, where things stand, Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, is now the acting president. She's backed by the military and the security services so far. What we've seen is autocrat change, not regime change. So right now, the institutions that sustain Maduro remain very much intact. And I think rather than a political opening, the repression has intensified. We've seen the arrest of journalists. Violence has increased. The colectivos are on the street. And though political prisoners have started to be released, I think that's a very positive sign. And that's not obviously that's continuity under pressure. That's not democratic transition. And that distinction, I think, is critical because it frames the scenarios ahead. So I think for my time, again, at the NSC, we always worked with scenarios rather than aspirations. So I think there are three broad paths that all this could take. The first is obviously the one that we are in, which is continuity. You have the same course of institutions and networks that remain under control. The second is escalation. I think there's a very real danger that the internal fractures, Chavismo is not a monolithic structure. It's a coalition of different actors that frankly don't like each other very much. And this could make it very difficult and even armed actors proliferate. You end up the US maybe getting drawn deeper into managing this instability. And then the last one is a genuine democratic transition. And that, I think, remains to be seen. This administration hasn't even really paid lip service to it. What does this mean for U.S. power? I think the Trump administration has stated openly that the U.S. is now running Venezuela, particularly its oil sector. I think from an NSC perspective, that's an extraordinary assertion. I think ownership creates obligation, and once a country claims responsibility, it inherits the consequences. And I think this approach reflects what you referred to as the revival of the Monroe Doctrine, or if you want to get really academic, it's the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, or what the president's been calling it, the Dunroe Doctrine. And I think this emphasizes, if I were to summarize it, it emphasizes unilateral enforcement, speed, and frankly transactional outcomes. And I think that's a worldview that's been championed by Secretary Rubio while he was in the Senate, and now is as Secretary of State. And that means that power, rather than negotiation, is the primary currency in hemispheric affairs. And I think if this approach succeeds, if it produces stability, frankly, I think there's a chance that Rubio pulls this off. In a year from now, we have free and fair elections in Venezuela. I think the probability is low, but if it produces stability, economic recovery, and then ultimately democratic governance, it will mean two things. I think first, in the United States, it will support the argument that the means justify the ends. And that's very dangerous. And I look forward to unpacking what that means in terms of the US debate, which I think is different from the international debate to a certain extent. But it would also represent a profound paradigm shift in US Latin American relations. But if it fails, I think there are many more ways that this could go horribly sideways. Venezuela becomes a huge political burden for Washington and for the region. I can say, I think in this case, the ambition exceeds the capacity. I think managing Venezuela's security and reconstruction without the U.S. actually having a sustained military presence on the ground is extremely unlikely. And the U.S. is unlikely to commit to that presence, especially in a midterm election year. Donald Trump is not going to want to defend another forever war in the midterms where Republicans are already pretty far behind, especially in the House. And I think that gap between asserted control and actual capacity is where this policy falters. I want to mention two things. One is the focus on the oil sector, and then to your question on the international limits here, I think oil sits at the center of this strategy, but it's frankly, it's been misunderstood. I think the president characterizes this as the panacea for the United States and for Venezuela, but the reality is that the reserves in Venezuela are vast, but there are years of underinvestment. There's infrastructure decay. There's been a brain drain on Venezuela, and the insecurity, frankly, mean that production cannot be rapidly expanded. So the near-term gains are really about stabilizing output, not transforming the economy. And I think the real lever here is the sanctions authority that the United States has under the International Emergency Economy Powers Act, IEPA as we refer to it. Oil is being allowed to flow, but the proceeds are placed in controlled accounts, and the funds can be released only for licensed purposes such as like humanitarian imports or limited stabilization spending. So this is basically an escrow model, and it preserves U.S. leverage but delays normalization and Venezuelan sovereignty over its economic decisions. I think from an NSC perspective, this approach has clear limits. Institutionally, it depends on extraordinary executive authority and a sustained interagency control, and that is politically very fragile and easily reversible, especially as this is going to be a years-long undertaking, and Donald Trump is going to leave office after 2028, we hope. Internationally, Venezuela is the outlier, right? Diplomatically isolated, sanctioned, and fragmented. I think applying this model to other countries would require regional support that is unlikely to materialize. So I don't see this happening in a country like Colombia. And this is where Brazil really matters, because Brazil has consistently emphasized the importance of dialogue, regional solutions, and multilateral legitimacy. I think that goes to the center of international law, right? International humanitarian law in particular. And those principles remain essential, because I think without the regional buy-in, the unilateral responses risk deepening fragmentation rather than solving it. So if this goes horribly sideways, the United States is going to need the region. And I think at that point, I think now is the time for Brazil to really be laying out the path forward for Venezuela, given what's going on. Yes, let's criticize what this administration has done, but what's the path ahead, right? Because as far as Americans are concerned, they care very little. I think many of them can't even find Venezuela on a map, to be honest. And so what they're going to think about this in terms of the application of U.S. military, the impact on the U.S. economy, the safety of Americans. That's really the context that somebody, in Peoria, Illinois, or East Lansing, Michigan, as opposed to Washington, D.C., that's how they see the Venezuela challenge. And I think for South America, the central question is not who controls Venezuela's oil, but whether Venezuela can return as a stable, sovereign, and democratic member of the region. I think stability imposed from the outside is fundamentally brittle. Democracy without institutions is hollow. And a lasting solution requires Venezuelan ownership, the regional engagement where Brazil, I think, plays an important role as a regional convener, and a bridge between the G7 and the G77 countries. I think it plays a vital role, not just on international coordination, frankly, but on not just on international coordination, but not just the pressure on the U.S. So let me close with this. Maduro's removal was unquestionably dramatic. I think what follows now is decisive, and Venezuela's future will not be determined by that operation that removed one man, but whether the next phase aligns with pressure, legitimacy, and regional cooperation toward fundamentally a democratic end. And I think when it comes to this administration, they could care less about what the international community thinks. This is fundamentally about Donald Trump, his legacy, and fundamentally, given his penchant for self-dealing, what direct benefit comes to his family. And the only way that this will actually change direction in the mind of the president is if the U.S. population actually starts pushing back. And we're already starting to see that There was a war powers resolution that passed yesterday where you had 5 Republicans that dissented and actually voted for the resolution. That resolution would limit the president's power to actually put boots on the ground. It won't, even if it for some miracle it gets to the president's desk, he'll veto it and it won't pass. But it shows that right now in the United States, the opposition to Donald Trump is not coming from the Democratic Party. It's coming from within the Republican Party itself. And I think that will only continue to increase as this situation continues to deteriorate. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you so much, Juan. Great. And Chris, what do you see as now the implications for Venezuela and the region and political risks? We want you to listen. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Fernanda, and also Hussein. Phenomenal to be with you on the panel as well. Listen, I think Juan laid out, very well the way to think about this and the different scenarios. I would very much agree with this framing. But let me give you a couple kind of quick thoughts as to kind of how we're thinking about Venezuela impacts on the region and even on Brazil. Starting with Venezuela, Juan, I think I agree with you. We're in a fluid situation, and we have a series of challenges. We have a U.S. administration that is unwilling or not disposed to be able to put boots on the ground. We have a kind of dictatorial regime with fractures within the regime, and Delcy Rodriguez will have to deal with competition from within. And we have the wild card of how the streets will behave. So that's all kind of tough to be able to calibrate how this will unfold. But I will say that our view in the near term over the next coming months, we're a little bit less worried about social unrest than we were prior to this national grab, because the successful of the operation itself, working with the vice president and now president Delcy Rodriguez, and there is a threat of the U.S. military action against any other factions that try to be able to take her out. So that is a limiting factor on actors like Diosdado Cabello. So we think that it is a equilibrium that will hold. The White House is not interested in elections, clearly, but we do work with a scenario of elections over the next 1 to 2 years. And part of the reason is, that we'll get pressure from the private sector of companies coming into Venezuela. I think they're going to look for certain assurances. You do have Marco Rubio more keen towards a timeline for elections in the future. So I would say that this will probably initiate a process with a lot of potential instability over the next year, and hard to handicap how this will unfold. But we do think that this is probably a pivotal moment where we will have a return to elections at some point in a longer time horizon. So, obviously a lot to unpack, and it's very fluid. I agree with your characterizations, but that's kind of where we land as a firm. When we look at the regional repercussions, fully agree that the military operation in Venezuela is not replicable elsewhere. It is astounding the number of hotspots that were put on the table immediately in the aftermath of the action. In the press conference with President Donald Trump and Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth threatened Mexico, Cuba, Colombia, Greenland, very much on the topic. But we think that military action in Colombia and Mexico are very unlikely. We have upcoming elections coming up in Colombia where a conservative or centrist candidate will get elected. So it doesn't make any sense to be able to do something in a lame duck Petro administration. And I think that the telephone call between Trump and Petro is a recognition of that diagnosis in the White House. Mexico, you have a very good working relationship between President Claudia Sheinbaum and President Donald Trump. There were tiffs in that, but kind of military action, without the acceptance of the Mexican forces, we also think is unlikely. Cuba, we're keeping an eye on. I would say that I think that the strategy is to have economic stranglehold, trying to see a collapse from regime within. So when we look at the hotspots in the region in the aftermath of the Venezuela and the successful operation that showed embolden President Trump, right? That's important. He comes out feeling emboldened. We're looking more at Cuba than Mexico or Colombia. Okay. Third point is obviously the U.S. action in Venezuela reinforces what has already been made abundantly clear over the course of 2025, is that this is a White House that will have a strategic focus on the Western Hemisphere. This was made clear in the national security doctrine. Even President Trump is calling it himself and using the term of the Dunroe Doctrine, and as a result, this is an administration that will be looking to leverage, influence, and shape in the region. Although I would say that the heuristic of spheres of influence in the backyard of the United States that can meaningfully exert influence not only politically but also on things like trying to restrict Chinese presence in the region, I think that's a more appropriate analogy for Central America, Mexico, obviously Venezuela, maybe Colombia, but not the rest of South America. I think that when you look at these countries, they're much more dependent on access to the U.S. market. The U.S. has a lot more leverage to be able to, to sway policy. But you look at South America, and obviously we put Brazil in that category. These are countries that are not as dependent upon the U.S., access to the U.S. market. I think that they have a larger Chinese presence from a trading relationship, even from an investment point of view. And the White House, and what we hear from our sources, they're worried about the Chinese presence, but not willing to use that leverage to try to be able to tell the Chileans or the Peruvians or the Brazilians, listen, if you don't restrict Chinese presence, then A, B, and C. So I think that the U.S. leverage and ability to influence outcomes is much more limited in South America than it is in Central America, Mexico, Caribbean, and obviously Venezuela. So let's not over-rotate on how much the Dunrow Doctrine is a game changer for the region, right? I think it's important for us to recognize. When I look at kind of what does this mean for the electoral landscape in Latin America and elections, obviously the initial reaction from many in Washington is we've seen U.S. interventionism in the region historically. What we saw in Venezuela, on the one hand, is not so different from what we've seen in the past. Let's remember the U.S. action in Panama with Daniel Noriega in 1989, very similar type of look and feel. So this isn't breaking precedent. And the instincts of many in Washington is like, oh, this could generate an anti-U.S. sentiment in the region of kind of a heavy hand and a reaction against this type of operation. But I just don't see that when it comes to this operation. In fact, I think that there is broad public opinion support for U.S. action in Venezuela. I'll call attention to kind of an Atlas Intel poll that was published in October, and on average, 54% of Latin Americans supported military action in Venezuela to take out Nicolas Maduro. There's variation, higher support in the Caribbean, higher support in the Andean countries. Brazil's in the middle of the road, less support and more anti-American sentiment in Mexico. So there's differences here. We had a poll published in Chile, 70% supported what was happened in Chile, and in Mexico, less than half, right? So there's regional differences, but this is a Latin American public that is very worried about security. Security is the number one issue in most of the countries in Latin America. And if you have a U.S. action to take out a dictator with no popular support and under the guise of combating narco trafficking, that's not a type of action that will generate an immediate backlash in the region, right? And interestingly enough, support for the U.S. action is higher in Latin America than it is in the United States, right? In the United States, support is lower. In fact, the Republican senators that voted for this War Powers Resolution Act, they're probably reacting to independent voters that are not really looking at this, very favorably. So the backlash from a public opinion point of view is higher in the United States than it is in the region. I think it's important for us to keep in mind, and that's why this is a political football in Brazil. And we look also in terms of the U.S. action and what this means for the region. I'll say that we are headed an election cycle in Latin America that is turning right. For a couple of reasons. We're in a cycle where being an incumbent is harder. Approval ratings across the region have been, particularly South America, less Central America, have been low. And so 4 years ago, we had a wave to the left, and now we're having a wave to the right. That's independent of ideological stripes. That's just more desire for change is more constant. And the issue of security is helping conservative candidates. So we had Cost winning in Chile. We're going to have a conservative candidate likely to win in Colombia. We're going to have probably a center conservative candidate in Peru. So we're going to have, and you add Ecuador and Argentina, we're going to have alignment, ideological alignment with the White House, independent of anything the White House does. This has nothing to do with U.S. action. This is domestically driven kind of sentiment for change. And so the potential for friction is mitigated. And then I'll finalize with a kind of a word on Brazil. I think that Brazil, it obviously President Lula predictably criticize the action as some other governments in the region. But there is I think that we're still on track for some kind of a deal between the US and Brazil. And the big story here, and why President Trump did the 180 on Brazil and kind of took out the sanctions and we're negotiating a potential tariff relief, is that the White House in Washington looks at access to critical minerals and rare earths as extraordinarily strategic and priority zero. Brazil has a role to play on reducing these dependence on Chinese processing. Obviously, there were other factors at play for the turnabout at the White House, but it had much less to do with diplomatic skill of President Lula, his ability to charm, and or Itamaraty or lobbyists. It had more to do with a domestically driven assessment in the White House on the strategic importance of Brazil and the inefficacy of the previous sanctions and tariffs. And I think that holds. And I think that the presidential palace in Brazil will still want some kind of a deal. So we think that this action delays a deal, but it doesn't undermine a deal. And I think that Brazil is well positioned in their world of great power conflict, given the assets that they have. That's why I think Brazil is much more of a swing state and not much so much kind of subject to be a spheres of influence when thinking about the non-known doctrine. So let me pause here. I think my 10 minutes are up.
Thank you, Chris. Just perfect with time. So, Hussein, you mentioned in your check-in that this action was beyond the limits of the inacceptable, if I understood. We want to hear from you.
Thank you, Fernanda. It was really, really enlightening to hear Chris and Juan, which with so many strong points and arguments. And I completely agree with your both assessment, but I would like to add some another perspectives related to the situation. U.S. Historical trajectory in Latin America has been tragic, right? And if we do a comparison in the last 20 years, the United States has been, like, since 2000 till now, U.S. has been absent from the regional scenario. Vis-a-vis China, for example, China fulfilled the vacuum of power that the United States has left. And when you look today, what is the legacy of the United States in the last 25 years, what you can find is absence of development, absence of investment, and what you have is interventionism and expansionism. When you look vis-a-vis China, what they have accomplished, well, they strengthened their trade ties with most of the countries in Latin America, especially in South America. They increased drastically their trade relationships, and then they decided to invest massively in infrastructure in the region. So here, when you take both sides and you make a comparison, what it is, the U.S. contribution for the region the last 25 years, and what is China contribution in the last 25 years, you can summarize it by Bush absence in Latin America, who abandoned Latin America, and now with Trump, right? So basically, that put China in certain advantage. Now I'm thinking the decade ahead, because to me, this action is what is happening now is not a United States foreign policy to Latin America. It doesn't appear like that to several countries in the region. It looked like a very punctual action or punctual policy circumstantially to this moment. Is that will become a continuous foreign policy? We don't know, but it doesn't look like a consistent long-term strategic foreign policy, right? It looked like more like a kind of a Pirate of the Caribbean diplomacy. It's quite weird to say that, but it looked like, where our concern as Brazil and other Latin American countries, how to make Venezuela to become democratic, how we could pressure the regime through dialogue and make them to respect international norms, laws, especially in what related to human rights. But what has happening now, and why I'm saying United States historical trajectory is tragic, because now it was what Juan has said. It is it's removing of autocrat, but keeping the regime in power, right? That definitely will strengthen the regime, will strengthen the repression, right? I don't see it otherwise. I don't see in the near future a fair, transparent election or electoral cycle. And no matter what, the regime in power, even if Delcy Rodriguez leaves after an interim mandate, who will replace her is someone from the regime. And that's what in Brazil we don't want to see. And that's what several countries in Latin America, they don't want to see. They want to see Venezuela back to a normal social, political, democratic order. US action, it doesn't contribute to that. That is the point. And the way that how we perceive it, it is, of course, it's not about democracy, human rights, not about nothing, except about how to control natural resources of very important country in the region, right? So what will be the limit of that? A world order based on rule, it doesn't exist anymore. China will do the same in Taiwan and any other countries if they want. They could portray whatever narrative based on their Mao Zedong national security doctrine to abduct, arrest, kidnap whomever they want right now, right? The Russian, they could do the same. So what will be the limit and what will be the consequences when you don't have a world order based on minimum rules and norms, right? The question here, with sphere of influences, even with sphere of influence, but without the minimum standard of rule, that will lead to the anarchization of the international system, right? And now, most of the countries, the defense establishment, defense and military security establishment, everybody is thinking how to rearm itself in the next future, right? So, you know, in Brazil, we have within the military two blocks. The hardliners, let's put it that way, the more nationalist guy, the guys that they were absolutely in favor to weaponize the Brazilian nuclear program, and the other who they believe that, well, Brazil should renounce on nuclear capabilities for military purposes. Now this debate started to gain traction again, you know? So Brazil has important natural resources, it's a big country. What the ambition of the United States in the years ahead? And that's what the military are thinking right now. How we could defend ourselves from fragile narrative based on punctual action, where you are willing to disrespect the regional order, the minimum standard. So to which extent that will lead? I can guarantee you and assure you today in the defense establishment, everybody is thinking the next decade how to amplify the defense budget and where to invest it. And a lot of lines within the army, they want to reactivate the nuclear program or non-conventional Brazilian deterrence power. Secondly, let me conclude with that about the Monroe Doctrine. I think the Monroe Doctrine would, of course, we have to look to the time and space and the historical circumstance. The Monroe Doctrine, when it was conceived, it wasn't against Latin American states. It was against the imperial power of Great Britain, because the United States at that time were a recent, fairly young independent country, and they were fearing about European ambition over the United States and European ambition toward Mexico. So the idea to construct the Monroe Doctrine, it was against European imperialist ambition. It wasn't a license to invade, to implement regime change, and to use the legal military force against Latin American states. Of course, we had the Cold War during certain period, but Latin America has dramatically changed. And I think no matter what, this action will be traumatic, no matter what. And I think Chris said that we are in a cycle where right-wing candidates in Latin America seems to be closer to win the next round of election in the region. But frankly speaking, this action will strengthen more the left-wing guys rather than the right-wing governments, right? And just to conclude it, what China will do, because China has interest in Latin America, right? They have investment, they have strong trade relationship. What China will do, and how U.S. action will confront Chinese interest in the region, and what China reaction will be either here or in other places. Our concern, it is as Brazil, right? Our concern, if China decides to invest more in defense in the region, and especially across South America. You have to remember that China has an advanced military post in southern Argentina, right? And if Milei loses the election, you have left-wing government in Argentina. What will be Chinese ambition there, right? And we don't want to see nor U.S. military presence in our region, and nor Chinese military ambition in our region. So I think the consequences of this action will remain resounding for the years ahead, and that will open a very dangerous door for much more instability in how the United States it is perceived in the region, that it doesn't contribute. And from Brazilian standpoint of view, actually nor the right nor the left are happy about what has happening, right? Even if you see some Bolsonaristas like, making some noise, but at the end, they know, right, that this circumstance, it is absolutely dangerous to Brazil's role in South America, specifically in South America and in Latin America at large. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hussein, and especially for bringing the role of extra-regional actors such as China and Russia to our discussion, and how they can play now a different role after the U.S. intervention, what that can trigger. So let's move backwards now with our speakers and hear from Chris, because we have a question from the audience, and I would like to question you, Chris. What does it mean to Brazil, the new U.S. national security strategy published last November, and especially exploring Eurasia experience on top risks analysis? What are the risks, the main risks for the Brazilian election later this year?
Yeah, no, thank you, Ariana. I mean, I think that we at the Eurasia Group, we have a top risks document at the beginning of every year. We put the Donroe Doctrine as kind of a third global risk. I think that is, there's a broader point, of course, that the successful action in Venezuela will embolden the president. And as a result, risks not only flow in the region, but also elsewhere. I think that the hotspot right now is Greenland. In terms of the transatlantic relationship is probably more in the hotspot right now in the immediate term than it is in Latin America. So, obviously this is a very kind of aggressive, kind of a second Trump term, willing to go move the needle on what he wasn't able to do in his first mandate. And we're seeing the manifestations of this in the self-entitled kind of, Dunrow doctrine. For Brazil, I'm having a harder time teasing out immediate repercussions, particularly for the elections coming in October. As I said, I think that Brazil is a bit more insulated from this type of, aggressive U.S. action, given the strategic import that Brazil has in the region, kind of, significant, critical mineral rare earths deposit, which is very important for Washington. And you saw the Trump administration backtracking from the policies of sanctions and tariffs, because they weren't effective on the one hand. They're very, important economic interests from U.S. companies in Brazil that lobbied the White House on the other. And so I think the White House is going to have less of more of accommodating stance on Brazil for that reason. For the election, it would not come at all of a surprise if President Trump would endorse the opposition candidate, whoever makes it to a runoff against President Lula, coming October. But I don't think that Trump's policy positions or preferences will sway the Brazilian voters. Brazilian voters they'll be making their decisions much more by their day-to-day lives, how they're dealing with security, the efficacy of the campaign. If you have heavy-handed tactics of the U.S. administration in Brazil, it could backfire, much like it backfired, back in July with the tariffs, would increase Lula's approval ratings. And I do think that if the White House does heavy-handed tactics in Colombia, it'll backfire as well, and it could help leftist candidates. So I think that, my overall point is that there's not a backlash from a public opinion view in the region. I don't think it helps leftist candidates at the get-go, but much will depend on what the U.S. does individually. And what we've seen is that when you do have heavy-handed tactics, it does kind of generate a nationalist rally around the flag effect. We saw that in Mexico. We saw that in Brazil. And so I think, but if the U.S. does not engage in aggressive action, then the influence will be muted. So I think that the repercussions are modest. But I would say in the near term, the opposition's and the conservative governors' support of Trump, and has more public opinion sway, and they're more aligned with public opinion than the criticisms of the action on violating sovereignty. Just from a public opinion point of view, not independent of the merit of the position, and completely understandable criticisms and the worrying precedent this generates. But from a public opinion point of view, I don't think that the opposition is the bad place in how they're talking about this intervention.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Chris. And following Chris' analysis, Juan, what do you think it will be the next landscape for Latin America in this political cycle? I have a question from the audience, which is, could this pull some countries towards a left-leaning political path in response to U.S. interventionism? And Colombia is one of the examples here. Is Colombia, because there are protests right now in Colombia against Trump, and elections will be held in May. So how do you see that in the hemisphere of this new political cycle with general and presidential elections?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think Christopher really outlined this very clearly. And right now, the administration, and Secretary Rubio said this early on during his tenure, where he said that they're trying to build a right-wing coalition in Latin America. So they've really, been supportive of right-wing candidates, including pardoning Juan Orlando Hernandez, former president of Honduras, who was convicted by a grand jury for trafficking 500 metric tons of cocaine into the United States, much more than maybe allegedly Maduro was involved in. But it's backfired. I think Trump's support for Bolsonaro actually helped Lula in Brazil, and right now in Colombia, Gustavo Petro's poll numbers at this point are much higher. They're more than twice the approval that Ivan Duque had around this time. I mean, Ivan is, I think, a very effective and technocratic president, but was very unpopular given that he governed essentially during a pandemic. And Petro's chosen candidate is right now very far ahead in the polls. Certainly, we won't really know where the Colombian election is headed till around March, but it's a signal that the United States can sometimes undermine its own interests by trying to get involved in the internal politics of a country. But I want to say a couple things here that I think Hussein and Christopher mentioned a couple points that I want to kind of bring together on kind of the nature of U.S. engagement, what this means for internationalism, and that are really important. I think the first thing I would say is look, if Maduro's capture actually leads to lasting stability in Venezuela, history might end up seeing this as a real break from a very dark chapter and actually judge this well, and it could end up validating a much more assertive U.S. role in the region. And I think that should really, at a time when the international system really struggles to deal with autocracies, I think it's something that we need to think about how multilateralism can really tackle breakdowns in democratic order and the violation of human rights in a lot of countries. Because from the U.S. perspective, and Rubio has said this directly, is that the UN releases really strongly worded statements, but it doesn't take action to prevent the suffering. And so I think there is a space for whether it's UNASUR or the OAS or Brazil in its kind of international leadership role. And Brazil has a foreign policy vision and the wherewithal to execute it. How do you strengthen and put more teeth into multilateralism to actually tackle these sorts of systems to prove that another way is possible? And I think that's going to be really important in balancing the United States. The other is, I think Hussein is very right that right now, Russia may be embracing this concept of spheres of influence, but China is not. If you read, I think some of the premier think tanks in China, they're saying, no way we're going to cede the Western Hemisphere. And so they're going to continue to play an assertive role given their economic and diplomatic interests. And I think that countries are going to start choosing. You have US, Russia, China, to a certain extent, India, that are seeing the world that they can carve it up and are thinking about this in terms of territorial expansion. And the rest of the world, including Europe, but Brazil and others, are thinking, where do we fit into this? How do we navigate this space? And I think it would be a huge mistake for the United States to continue this approach in a way that actually pushes away such a strategically important country like Brazil, toward interests across the Atlantic and into Asia. So I think, but I think that, I think it's important to mention here, and this touches on what Hussein was mentioned, that, obviously in this century and the last, but also throughout its history, the U.S. has relied on military power to shape outcomes in the hemisphere. And I think that made sense maybe for a different era, but not for today. And I think today the key point is that the battle for the hearts and souls of Latin America and the Caribbean is economic. I think China understands this probably better than we do. Beijing hasn't sent troops into the region, but it has sent credit, infrastructure, supply chains, market access, roads, ports, what have you. And that's how they're building influence. I think if the United States wants to compete, and if it wants to promote stability and democracy, the fight is through economic statecraft and giving agency to countries. I mean, not to get historical here, but during World War II, I think Tulio Vargas would have been very happy to sit out World War II, because I think rightly so, and today I think they're analogs to the situation in Ukraine. They view what's happening right now in Europe within the context of 200 fights for control of Central Europe. And that's something that does not impact Brazil and its interests. And it wasn't until the United States, started kind of helping develop a steel industry in Brazil, the role of Cornell Extension to help Brazil develop an agricultural sector. Without Brazil, World War II was not won. And it was not through pressure that we got Brazil on board, but rather actually understanding that Brazil has agency, it is a strategic partner, and that the United States needs to invest in the future of countries like Brazil. And that means today, the development of AI, the development of new health technologies, quantum computing, and all these sorts of developments that are revolutionizing the world economy. And I think that is something that has to be key. It has to follow on whatever this administration is doing in Venezuela. It has to be accompanied with a very robust set of economic measures on that. To that, I'll give an example, and then I'll shut up. Is I think in the United States, the decision by Treasury to support Argentina, I think it's a perfect example. The use of the Exchange Stabilization Fund to help Argentina reduce its reliance on Chinese credit was smart policy. It was not popular here in the United States. It was very heavily debated. Didn't solve Argentina's problems, but it reduced the vulnerability. And I think the U.S. needs to really think outside of the box to do a lot more of that, to really kind of show the region that, and particularly the populations, that the United States is not just going to advance its unilateral interests and treat the U.S. or the region as bystanders that have no agency, but rather one where we know that the prosperity, security, and development of Latin America and the Caribbean is fundamentally strategically important to us. And I think until we're able to articulate that And as the U.S., we struggle to do that. I think we're going to be at a disadvantage in the long term when it comes to kind of the geopolitical, kind of great power competition that is right now reaching a kind of a peak. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan. So now we're running out of time. So I'd like to move back to Hussein. Hussein, we have a question here from the audience is about what can Brazil do to accelerate the democratic transition in Venezuela? So we have been betting on the dialogue for a long time. Which practical actions could Brazilian policymakers do? And I would like to propose this same question for us, starting Hussein and then Chris and then Juan and then with Elias.
Well, thank you, Ariane. Let me make an acknowledgement and a recognition to Juan's role when he was in Obama's administration and also in Biden administration. You have played a very important role, Juan, and I have to recognize that. We have met in Washington. And you really know and understand the complexity of Latin America, and you definitely worked harder to really build a U.S. consistent policy toward Latin America to counterbalance Chinese influence, building influence through dialogue, and especially vis-a-vis Venezuela, to building a positive dialogue with Brazil and also with other countries through cooperation, not through coercion. And I have to recognize that because you have made a lot of effort, and I know, really know about it. And especially during the Brazilian electoral process in 2022, U.S. played a really outstanding role, and which I'm really concerned about the next cycle this year. Perhaps will be the very opposite direction that you played, Juan and Jake Sullivan and others. But I must recognize, and here everybody in Brazil recognizes, either parties from the right, center, left, whatever, they recognize U.S. Diplomatic position at that time, and that definitely helped to strengthen the Brazilian democracy, right? Well, going to your question, Ariane, what Brazil can do to accelerate democratic transition, I think nothing. Now it's impossible. I think the regime will become much more aggressive, in my opinion, because they want to protect first themselves. They want to protect the infrastructure, even if you have animosity among some members of the regime. But now what we can see is they are trying to put their divergences aside to keep the regime cohesion. And in the short term, it will be unlikely to see Venezuela moving toward democratic transition. I think Brazil's role, we tried to pressure Maduro, why we tried to construct a regional solution to that. And when he stole the last election, we did not recognize his government. We did not recognize his election. But if you look nowadays, what has happened, immediately after Delcy Rodriguez fulfilled the vacuum of power, Brazil immediately recognized her as legit president of Venezuela. So Brazil alone won't build a solution to Venezuela. It must be regional solution to Venezuela. And I don't see that being happening in the short period of time. Due to the nature of the regime and due United States interests. Now, a democratic elected president in Venezuela doesn't serve Trump's administration interests. Perhaps an independent president in Venezuela and democratic president in Venezuela won't accomplish with Trump's contract, perhaps, right? So in my perception, keeping in the regime, you have three things. One, you don't have to worry about social stabilization, right? It's different than Iraq. What's the similarity? Actually, violation of international law. But there, U.S. had boot on the ground. The U.S. dismantled the whole institution, the army, security apparatus, everything, which it doesn't look like in Venezuela, right? It's not the case, except the violation and the coercion and instability that generate. But look into Trump administration, why they want a democratic government in Venezuela. If they could extract through coercion better results to their economic private interest with this regime, right? So, and I think if Brazil wants to contribute to democratic transition now, I think Trump administration will be the obstacle to that. The obstacle to that. So, it's from Trump administration and looking to the statements, they prefer to have an autocratic regime bowing to Trump interests rather than to have independent, perhaps democratic electoral cycle in Venezuela. And now why immediately Trump discarded Maria Corina Machado, right? So I will stop here.
So no optimistic views from Hussein. Now I will pass to Chris.
I'm not optimistic at all.
Let's have your last contribution.
Except if Juan goes back to government in the next electoral cycle, then we can build something together, right, Juan? Otherwise, it will be very complicated.
I know. Let's try. So, Chris, do you believe in a regional solution at a time when the region's so divided, or are you also pessimistic?
Yeah, I'm not optimistic over the potential role that Brazil can play in intermediating some kind of transition in Venezuela. And I would echo Hussein's comments on Juan. He certainly needs to be congratulated on all the contributions that he gave. Absolutely. But very deserved. I just think that when you have the Trump White House, working with the regime, there's no opening to be able to, have a kind of a regional role. I think that actors like Brazil will have to be waiting on the sidelines and kind of opportunistically potentially play a role if at some point down the road, there is pressure for a return to democracy or a transition. They can, be kind of, put pressure on the global stage. We can see that more broadly, but, I think that this is really a Washington, Caracas, and Delcy Rodriguez story. But we'll have to see what the opposition does, right? One thing I would say is that there is more repression on the one hand, but they let go of the political prisoners on the other. And so I think Maria Corina Machado is going to have to decide whether she goes back to Venezuela and whether she can potentially mobilize the streets. That's a little bit of a wild card that we have to see how this plays out. So there could be a role there, but I think it's very limited. And listen, I just unfortunately have to sign off right now, given I have another prior commitment, but I want to thank so much CEBRI, Ariana, for the invitation. Juan, Hussein, as usual, it's a tremendous pleasure to be able to be here with you, and thank you for this very rich dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. On behalf of CEBRI, thank you so much for being with us. And Juan, let's go to you and have your last contributions to conclude our webinar, please.
I'll be brief. I'll say, look, I really am grateful for the comments from Hussein and Christopher, two people I respect greatly. And I think if there's anything I did right, is it really is a function of trying to really understand Brazil's worldview and listening to particularly the younger generation of Brazilian diplomats and academics that really have developed a very sophisticated foreign policy vision for Brazil, that as you understand how to deal with the region. So look, what I'll say is I'm not optimistic about Brazil's role to influence the situation in Venezuela, but I do see an opportunity for Brazil. At a time when the United States is retreating from international institutions, it is the time where, China is taking advantage of it as becoming the guarantor of global institutions. Now is the time for Brazil to play a much more vocal role as a spokesperson for, for the G77 non-aligned countries in how the international order should look in this environment. I would add to that, being a champion, particularly in organizations that the U.S. has announced it has left, the Human Rights Council and other places, and really stepping up its voice, not just on these institutions, but on human rights, the respect for democracy, and all these principles that are fundamental to Brazilian democracy, which today is frankly, actually, I would say stronger than that of the United States. And I think now is the time for the United States to really be for Brazil to really be pushing for UN Security Council reform, as we really think about how you make these institutions fit for purpose. So I think, separate from the political calendar that Brazil is entering, diplomatically, now is the time for Brazil to really be elevating its voice and mobilizing a conversation about how these institutions that were created by the United States and kind of the post-World War II countries, allied countries, to really build institutions that fit for purpose for the world that is today. So I think that's the optimism that I would leave behind. And I think if Brazil leaves its footprint, I think the world will be better for it.
Great.
Hussein, would you like to add something on Juan's contribution?
I would say I duly agree with Juan. Actually, Brazil definitely could really play a very important role in the multilateral system right now, especially in this very strange and dangerous world where rules and norms, are useless. It seems like useless to a certain point of view, to certain countries, but I definitely see Brazil playing an important and constructive role in the multilateral system. How successful that will be, I cannot measure it right now, but I think the world require right now leaders that they are capable to bring much more balance to the international system and to provoke a real and pragmatic debate about what will be the limit of international violations. Because if we are moving, if we are moving toward a world order non-based on normal rule and law, then we are really crossing a very dangerous bridge toward multiple wars across different regions, where I think not only the US, but also Brazil loses a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Hussein. So this is the bit of optimistic view I was looking for from both of you to conclude our webinar. So first, I would like to sincerely thank you, speakers, for your contributions and for being with us in such short notice and such a busy agenda. So yes, and on behalf of CEBRI, thank you for being part of this webinar, for all of our audience engaging and sending so many questions. We hope this exchange has contributed to a deeper understanding of the challenges facing Latin America, Brazil, Venezuela, and we hope that it encourages continued dialogue in regional coordination. So we stay tuned to CEBRI's institutional site and social media for our next webinars and next events. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariane. Thank you, Juan.